Hi, I'm Dr. Chandler. Welcome to Psychological Disorders Video Notes 2. This is an overview of neurotic psychological disorders. I encourage you to print the notes provided for you and to take your own notes in the space provided. Let's begin. Neurotic is a word that is currently out of favor with psychologists and psychiatrists because it was so overused for so long that they feel it has lost its meaning. However, I think it is still a useful term to use as a category of certain kinds of psychological disorders. Varying levels of productivity in work and relationships are natural. However, when a person suffers a neurotic disorder, he or she can usually function, but at lower levels than he or she is capable of. Here is a diagram indicating the continuum between healthy functioning and suffering a neurotic disorder. We each move along this continuum throughout our lifetime with some prescribed area that is dictated by our genetics and our lived experience. We usually describe functioning as being able to maintain relationships with family and friends and to be productive at work. However, think about how your relationships and your work suffer when you have the flu. You have a lower level of productivity and little enjoyment of your relationships and activities when you are sick. You struggle to get your daily tasks completed. This is the experience of those suffering neurotic types of disorders. Here's the diagram of neurotic disorders that you will be required to diagram, label, and describe. You will also be asked to list one example of a neurotic disorder from those covered in this video lecture or in your textbook. You see in the diagram that individuals who suffer neurotic types of psych disorders feel vulnerable. They have difficulty coping with the problems they encounter on a daily basis. The world appears overwhelming and problems seem insurmountable. The person feels weak and unable to cope with daily life when suffering these kinds of disorders. The difference between occasionally experiencing these feelings and being diagnosed with a neurotic kind of psychological disorder depends upon how long an individual feels like he or she cannot cope and the specific symptoms that we will discuss related to these disorders. Individuals with these disorders suffer a great deal. However, they function at a lower level in their daily lives most of the time. Due to the emotional suffering, they struggle and they also will seek help, but not always. When they do seek help, their symptoms are treatable. When they do not seek help, sometimes they start to feel better without help over time. Sometimes an individual suffers one episode of a neurotic disorder and never again. More importantly, or more often, an individual with a neurotic disorder suffers the symptoms for much of his or her life beginning in adolescence or early adulthood and must continue treatment to function. Again, most of the time. Treatment allows the individual to feel better and to cope, but sometimes an individual tries one treatment after another for years and does not find a treatment that helps. Relationships can be impaired because the individual is self-absorbed with their pain. Work and productivity are impaired by the low energy, and the individual loses much to suffering a neurotic disorder. Neurotic types of psychological disorders are a variety of comparatively mild disorders. Comparatively mild, in this sense, mean that those who suffer these disorders experience a high degree of pain. However, compared to schizophrenia or character disorders, those with neurotic disorders, such as anxiety or mood disorders, are more treatable, curable, and not as damaging to relationships as are the psychotic, schizophrenic, personality, and character disorders that will be discussed in Psychological Video Notes 3. Neurotic disorders include anxiety and mood disorders, the so-called common cold of psychological disorders. Again, these disorders are described as being comparatively mild because they are more treatable than the other categories of psychological disorders that we will review, such as psychotic schizophrenia disorders and the character and personality psychological disorders. The anxiety and mood disorders are the most common kinds of psychological disorders and sometimes are curable or may diminish over time with no psychological treatment. At the extreme end of the continuum of a mood disorder, such as depression or bipolar, which is manic depression, an individual may experience a psychotic episode where they are out of touch with reality. Neurotic disorders also include somatoform kinds of disorders. Remember, in a neuron, the soma is a cell body. Now you see how the word soma also refers to bodily symptoms of psychosomatic disorders, where the emotional distress causes physical pain. Someone with a somatic disorder rarely, if ever, experiences a psychotic episode. Neurotic types of psychological disorders include anxiety disorders, overconcern extending to panic. Anxiety disorders frequently have somatic or physical symptoms such as sweating or dry mouth and heart palpitations. This is a disorder because the symptoms of normal apprehension or fear occur when not in a realistically dangerous situation. Generalized anxiety disorder is diagnosed when one suffers chronic and high levels of anxiety that do not have a specific cause or stimulus, such as muscle tension, diarrhea, and dizziness. Perhaps one wakes up in the morning and experiences dread and feels that something bad is about to happen and they cannot get out of bed. Phobic disorders are persistent, intense, unrealistic, and irrational fear of an object or a situation, such as snakes and spiders, when most snakes and spiders are not poisonous. Other phobias that cause individuals to decrease the places they go and the people they can see include claustrophobia, the fear of being in a tight, small space, or agoraphobia, being in a public space. One of the most common phobias is the fear of public speaking. Anxiety disorders are the excessive apprehension and anxiety or tension, heart palpitations, and fear that can be experienced continuously or diffusely. Panic disorder, such as what you feel when you are being cut off in speeding traffic. However, with panic disorder, you don't have the being cut off in speeding traffic to have the reason for the terrifying psychological and physiological experience of panic. Panic and other anxiety disorders are recurrent attacks of overwhelming anxiety that usually occur suddenly and without warning. It is not uncommon for a person to be admitted into emergency services believing that he or she is experiencing a heart attack when they are experiencing a panic attack. Once someone experiences a panic attack, like driving down a highway, it is very difficult for the person to get in a car, let alone drive on a highway. Obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, is another kind of anxiety disorder. The obsessive-compulsive cycle begins with the obsessions or recurring unwanted thoughts, such as, I need to check the light switch or the locks on the door, with the anxiety that something bad will happen if I do not get up and go do this. The bad feeling will not go away unless I get up and check the switches and the locks. The compulsion is that I then go check the locks, and while I am doing this, my bad feeling is dispelled, and I feel some sense of relief. However, when I return to what I was doing, I have a niggling feeling of anxiety. What if I missed a lock? What if I accidentally unlocked a lock while I was checking to see if it was locked? I should go and make sure that the locks are all locked as they should be, and I'm back in the obsession phase of this cycle again. It becomes very difficult to have normal relationships or a job with the interfering obsessions, anxiety, and compulsive behaviors of OCD. You just saw a PET scan, or positron emission tomography, where we could see the overactive areas of the brain with OCD. Again, obsessive compulsive disorder is the inability to stop persistent and uncontrollable intrusions of unwanted thoughts, called obsessions, and the accompanying urges or actions to carry out ritualistic behaviors, called compulsions. There's now brain surgery where an electrode can be implanted to destroy certain overactive regions of the brain in an effort to eliminate obsessions and compulsions. Mood disorders are characterized by emotional extremes and tend to be episodic, involving emotional disturbances that affect physical, cognitive, and social processes. Depression disorders are defined by the persistent feelings of sadness and despair, often losing interest in previously enjoyed activities. Depression often includes the alterations in sleep and eating patterns, with low energy, slower speech, low self-esteem, and feelings of worthlessness. Depression is defined by experiencing 2 or more weeks of feelings of worthlessness and the diminished interest and diminished pleasure in most activities without some external cause. Additionally, an individual may feel anxious and irritable. Major depression includes feelings of hopelessness, dejection, massive guilt, worry, and social withdrawal. Bipolar disorder, or manic depression, is characterized by 1 or more bouts of mania and 1 or more bouts of depression. Manic episode is defined by the experience of a euphoric mood, high confidence, optimism, high energy, little if any sleep, fast talking, and grandiose plans, and may involve sexual or financial recklessness. Here is a continuum for mania and depression, or so-called bipolar disorder, because of the 2 opposing poles of mood. In extreme mania, an individual may experience a psychotic episode, such as believing they won the lottery and are wealthy and run up huge debt, when they are in fact broke. Somatoform disorders involve psychological distress being experienced with physical, called somatic for body, symptoms without apparent physical cause. Somatoform disorders have no organic basis, yet have real psychological consequences. Somatoform disorders involve a history of a variety of complaints such as cardiovascular, gastrointestinal, neurological, health issues. Conversion disorder refers to the psychogenic symptoms, meaning they have an origin in the mind, such as blindness, deafness, paralysis, when these problems have no known physiological cause. Conversion disorders usually involve a single organ system or limb's loss of function, such as hearing or glove anesthesia. Hypochondriasis is the excessive preoccupation with one's health and body and the fear of various presumed diseases and constant complaints about serious illness. There is usually a marked overinterpretation of all physical symptoms. Dissociative disorders are marked by a loss of memory and division of consciousness with personal identity. Dissociations are alterations in one's state of consciousness of identity due to prolonged traumatic events, such as a soldier in battle feeling that he or she is watching a movie and the battle is occurring in slow motion, rather than having a first-hand experience. Sometimes, when we cannot escape a traumatic experience, we distance our experience of it as if it is happening to someone else at a distance. This is called a feeling of derealization. Sometimes dissociative disorders are experienced with symptoms of somnambulism, which is sleepwalking, and fugue states, where one has no memory of one's own actions. Dissociative identity disorder, or multiple personality disorder, involves the presence of two or more distinct identities or personalities in one body. Each has a name and characteristic style, often opposite to the host, with sudden shifting from one to another. The etiology or cause of dissociative disorders is thought to be excessive stress, trauma, and abuse, as well as a fantasy-prone personality and a culture that supports the development of this disorder. An example of a dissociative disorder is multiple personality or dissociative identity disorder, DID. Here are some of the more obvious and hidden signs. Remember that this is not schizophrenia, which is a split from reality. DID is not a psychotic disorder and is thought by many to be a very rare disorder, with perhaps only several with this diagnosis in the United States at any given time. Amnesia and fugue are also examples of dissociative disorders. Amnesia and fugue include the sudden break from past memories and personal identity. Amnesia may be brief due to trauma, such as occurs with a blow to the head, most usually in soccer actually, not football. Or amnesia can be long-lasting with no memory of some experience or time in one's life. Fugue involves the complete loss of identity and memory of past, starting a new life sometimes with a new identity. Remember to be prepared to diagram, label, and describe neurotic disorders, and to be able to list and describe at least one example of a neurotic disorder for a test. Kinds of neurotic disorders that we reviewed here were mood disorders, anxiety disorders, somatoform disorders, and dissociative disorders.